we are going to make some old school tuna casserole, but of course I'm going to jazz it up a little bit. And then a blueberry crisp, and then we've got 3 kind of breads that we need to prep up. We're going to prep up a traditional sourdough loaf. We're going to prep up some sourdough focaccia for dinner tonight, and then we're going to prep up an apple cinnamon sourdough loaf as well. So let's start with our tuna casserole here. I have a friend who's in hospice care, and this is what she requested, so I'm happy to make it. I haven't made this in a very long time, so we're gonna torch jazz up a little bit. I'm gonna put in a whole pound of egg noodles. You gotta use egg noodles for this. I think that just gives you that classic casserole bake type dish for this. And then I'm just gonna give it I'm gonna get my pasta stir, but I'm gonna give it a little stir. We're not gonna cook these until they're completely done. You're gonna just cook them for about 5 minutes. They're gonna soak up a little bit more liquid in the bake when we bake it up. So I'm gonna check my watch, and then we'll take these out in about 4 minutes. While we're waiting for those to boil up, we're gonna prepare our blueberry crisp so it can start baking in the oven. So I'm going to start by putting in about 2 tablespoons of butter in my little this is a risotto, like a Le Creuset risotto pot, but a little Dutch oven. And we're gonna let that start to melt. And then I have about a little less than a pound of fresh blueberries in there because the kids stole some out. But we're using a good amount of our fresh blueberries to make the base of our blueberry crisp here. And we're gonna add to the blueberries to kind of sweeten it up. We're gonna add about a 1/2 cup of sugar, because again, our crisp topping will have lots of flavor in it, sugar, so we don't want to make the bottom part too sweet. So we're gonna add in about a 1/2 cup of granulated sugar, and then I have a fresh lemon here, and we're going to cut it up and squeeze half of our juice from our lemon. There we go. Doing the tango back and forth here. So just some juice from this is gonna add just a nice kind of tartness. It'll bring that little tartness out from the blueberries in here. And then we'll add a little bit of vanilla as well, which will kind of mellow these flavors out. Let's grab that seed. But we're gonna, again, just juice from about a half a lemon, which is probably gonna be around 1.5 teaspoons of juice, depending on how juicy your lemon is. Now I finally picked up some new vanilla. I got the big bottle. And we're gonna add in about a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla to this as well. And that's just gonna mellow out some of that flavor. So you'll have the lemon to bring out a little of that tartness, but then this will give a nice kind of, mellow taste to it. But unlike a peach or a apple crisp, I'm not going to add any cinnamon to it. So I kind of like to keep it plain for this. And we're gonna let these come to a nice boil until they're kind of started all popping and their juices are coming out. Then we'll add in a little bit of cornstarch to thicken it up. But while we're waiting for that to come to a boil here, we are going to prep up our crumb topping to go on it. So let me grab my brown sugar here, because we're gonna mix this in first. So we're gonna start with a 1/2 cup of melted butter, which is the same as 1 stick. I'm gonna add it all in here. Just gonna use this to scrape it all out. And then we're gonna add in a 1/2 cup of brown sugar. Make sure it's firmly packed. We're gonna mix those together, and then we'll add in a 1/2 cup of oats, and a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and a 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder. And then we'll add in our flour. So we first got our brown sugar in here. And this is gonna give you that just rich flavor on the crumble for the crisp, and it'll just be so delicious. That brown sugar just makes all the difference. Okay, we've got that in here. Now we're gonna add in a 1/2 cup of oats. You're gonna wanna use old-fashioned oats for this. That will just kind of help keep their texture and shape in this dessert. And we're gonna want a half a cup. And then I am going to pour out my noodles now because it's been just about 5 minutes. And again, you don't want to overcook them and you don't want to cook them until they're done. You want to cook them about 2 to 3 minutes less than their kind of cook time because they're going to cook longer in the oven and soak up the juices of the tuna casserole. So I'm just going to pour these in right now. Here we go. Kind of done with that. We'll let them sit over there and then we'll bring them back when it's time for it. But let me get our blueberries stirring here because you can see our sugar is starting to already dissolve and those juices from those blueberries are starting to come out. I'm gonna put that butter down. That little bit of butter is gonna be really important for the cornstarch and making sure that it just gets this nice little kind of jelly texture to it. A little bit of fat just, I think, makes the cornstarch turn out a little bit better. Okay, we've got our oats, so half a cup of oats in here. Now we're gonna add in a half a teaspoon of salt and a half a teaspoon of baking powder. That baking powder is going to give this little puff in our rise for our crumb on our crisp topping. That is just delicious. So we wanna do it, and we're gonna use a half a teaspoon. We're gonna mix this up and then we'll add in our flour. And we're gonna add about 3/4 of a cup of flour. It might be a couple tablespoons more because we want it to be just about the right crumbliness. We don't want it too wet because then it won't have the right bake up texture. Let's get our blueberries stirring here. We want them to sweat out their juices, but I don't want them necessarily to completely pop yet. I want some of them too. That way they kind of, you'll still have your blueberry texture here. So we're gonna do about 3/4 of a cup of flour for this. And then we're gonna mix it and kind of crumble together. I might add a little bit more because again, I always look at the texture of my crumb and see versus the exact measurements. So if it's too wet, then I'll want to add just a smidge more. So yeah, this one's it's a little bit wet, so I'm going to add just a bit more, but add it in slowly because it doesn't take a lot of flour to bring that crumb out, especially since the liquid is just about, butter in here. So we'll add in, we're going to add another tablespoon here. And then kind of getting it together here. It's starting to kind of clump apart. There we go. So it's kind of, I'm looking for it where it crumbles apart. So you'll have some big chunks, but they're not completely stuck together. That's gonna give you just like the perfect little bake up. If you don't add enough flour, then you're gonna have more of a soggy crisp. Just a smidge more. There we go. Okay, this is exactly what I want. So we've got, again, those big crumbs and then some little ones to it. And also you don't want it to be too dry because then it will be a really crumbly topping. Okay, well look at here. You see how just quickly our blueberries are starting to sweat it out? They're gonna be ready in just about a second. So while we're waiting for this to kind of bubble up, let's prep our peppers to go in for our tuna casserole. We're gonna have peppers, mushrooms, and peas as the vegetables in our tuna casserole. No onions, because my friend can't have onions right now, so we're just keeping it basic. And I'm jazzing it up. So it's not exactly your grandmother's tuna casserole. If you ever had them, I remember eating tuna casserole a lot at the childcare I went to growing up. Mrs. Robinson made tuna casserole a lot. But I'm gonna make it a little bit more jazzy, a little nicer. I'm gonna make my own cream of mushroom soup. So I already think that instantly is going to make it, better, because homemade cream of mushroom soup is just so delicious. Okay, let's get our peppers sauteed up here. I'm gonna kind of chop them in half and then make a nice little, thing, because I don't want them too big in there, because I don't want their texture to take away too much from it, because it is more of a softer casserole. There we go. But I think the peppers will just add a really nice flavor to this. Here we go. And then we'll start sauteing them in some olive oil. And then we'll do our mushrooms next. But peppers are gonna go first because they're a bit firmer, and so they need a little bit longer to cook up. Then we'll do our mushrooms. Okay, let's add in about 2 tablespoons of olive oil, or so, maybe 1.5. And this is again gonna be, we're gonna work on the veggie base for our tuna casserole. Okay, and then our blueberries are popping over here, so we are just about ready for them. Here we go. So you see we've got this nice kind of juice forming on our blueberries. Now this is lovely, but we don't want it to be too soupy. So I always add in a little bit of cornstarch and essentially making like a slurry that will thicken it up. And this will just create such a delicious kind of jelly texture with the crisp. It makes it to where it's not watery. So I'm just gonna kind of shake it over. We're gonna use probably about a tablespoon. I shake a little bit and then we're gonna mix it in. There we go. So I don't just like spoon it in, because then it's not going to dissolve well. It'll just have like little, cornstarch dumplings in there. So just, again, dust it over the top. We're gonna want about a tablespoon. There we go. Beautiful. And you want to do this with your really juicy fruits like blueberries, blackberries, strawberries, because they let out a lot of juice, and then what will happen is they will be runny and it'll make more for a soggy crisp. Okay, I'm going to turn off my stove here. And since this is going to be going to my friends, we're going to be putting it, it's right over here, in a little mini loaf pan for this. And that way they'll have it. And just take this. And we're going to give our peppers a little stir here. I'm going to turn this down to about a 4, so just like a medium, while we're doing it. Okay, so I'm going to pour in my blueberry base for it. And you can see it kind of covers about, I want to say, a third of the way here of our little loaf pan. And I'm making sure I get all of this delicious, blueberry gel off on there, because that's just going to add so much flavor. And now we're going to take our crumb topping that we made, and we're going to evenly sprinkle this over the top of it. And again, we used a half a teaspoon of baking powder in here. So that is going to, kind of react with the blueberry juices and that gel, and it's going to cause the crumb to kind of puff up, almost like a little bit like a cake, which just gives it a little bit more body in here and helps it kind of absorb up those natural liquids. There we go. I've been making a lot of crisps this summer, and I just feel like, it's such a summer food or picnic food in there, So we did mango crisp, we did our peach crisp, we did a blackberry one, a strawberry one. So just a couple more I want to make. There we go. So we've got our crumb topping on here, and I'm going to put this in the oven at 350. And we'll let this kind of bake up at 350 for this. Now, when I put my tuna casserole in, I'm going to move this down to the bottom and we'll raise the temperature of our oven up. But for now, I'll just put it on here. And this takes about 25 minutes to cook up. So I'm gonna set my timer so I'll know when the tuna casserole in, because since I'm gonna raise the heat up, I'm gonna reduce a little bit of that time for that. But I'm gonna make sure it's directly under the tuna casserole, not to give it as much direct heat. Okay, let me slide this over. I'm gonna wash my hands real quick. Got a little bit of that crumb topping. And let's get our mushrooms kind of prepped up for our tuna casserole base. So we got our peppers here. I've got about a pound of baby bellas, because again, I want to make my own kind of cream of mushroom soup with this. Now, at home, if we weren't, keeping the onions out for dietary restriction, I would say add a yellow onion, dice it up, and then saute it first and then add in the peppers for it. You could also omit any of the vegetables if you don't like them. So peppers don't have to be in there, but there's something that you can add. So there's a couple other vegetables you can do to add great flavors. You could always do a little bit of diced celery, spinach, always, green beans. Those all can kind of go in there and work well with this. There we go. And we'll get our mushrooms sauteing up here. I want to really bring out their flavors because we're going to be using that to make kind of our cream of mushroom soup.
You have a question? Would this recipe work with chicken?
Yep, you could definitely do it with chicken. It's one of those things where you could actually really kind of change the protein around with a lot of different things. You could do an Italian sausage. It would kind of change the little flavor profile of it, but it would give you that just kind of nice flavor. You could even do like a smoked sausage and cut up in here. Because I know that tuna isn't everybody's cup of tea. So yes, you could definitely change it around. Okay, I'm just gonna add a little bit more oil in here. Actually, I'm gonna add, we'll do a little oil. Just because mushrooms are very porous and they're gonna soak it up really fast, and I wanna make sure I have enough on it to get this nice kind of crisp on it. Lost the pepper. There we go. So I'm just gonna spread those mushrooms out, and I'm going to turn up my temperature now to about a 6. I want it a little bit higher for the mushrooms so that they get their flavor out for our kind of cream of mushroom soup that we're going to do. Let me roll up my sleeves because they're rolling down. It's like my favorite sweatshirt, but it is super loose. Let's while we're waiting for the mushrooms to kind of soft out, we're gonna get our panko breadcrumbs kind of seasoned up here. We need about a cup, a little more than a cup of panko breadcrumbs. And this is gonna go over the top of our, so there's about a cup. We'll just add a little bit more. This is gonna go over the top of our casserole. It's gonna give it a little crunch, but there are so many different variations that you could do. You could do crispy onion strings, kind of like a green bean casserole. Potato chips apparently has been people love it. Or if you have stale potato chips, you crunch them up and you add them on there, and they add like a great flavor as well. But we're just sticking with the classic breadcrumbs here. And then I'm gonna use a little bit of Parmesan. I'm gonna reach in there, grab this is gonna be about, by the time I'm done crushing it up, it's gonna be like about a tablespoon or so. And we're just gonna crush it up. You could also use already shredded Parmesan, but I always have the flakes because I prefer the flakes. But it's about 1 to 2 tablespoons of Parmesan. And we're gonna put it in here. And it's just gonna add a little extra crunch to it. Parmesan is one of those cheeses that crisps up really nice when you bake it. And we're gonna add in some oil. We need about 2 tablespoons of oil here. And I'm just gonna lightly drizzle it over so I can kind of see it, because that's gonna allow it to kind of really crisp up on the top of our things. We'll mix those up when we get a spoon, or really I'll get a fork to toss it. And we're just kind of mixing it. It might actually work better with my fingers. So I'm just gonna mix it until that oil is kind of coating all of those. And this is, again, gonna help it kind of really crisp up on the top of our tuna casserole, which will just add a nice flavor. Now you could also use seasoned if you wanted to. The Parmesan cheese in here is gonna give it a little bit of a seasoning as well. Okay, let's check these mushrooms out. There we go. We're starting to get a nice little sear on them. See, we've got a couple with this beautiful golden brown coloring on it, which will be perfect. So I'm just essentially taking like an old school recipe and just making it a little bit fresher. It's like my green bean casserole that I make. I don't use canned green beans in it. I don't use prepackaged crispy onions. I always make everything from scratch. And I think it can take a dish that a lot of people are like, oh, and elevate it to make it a lot nicer. And this is where homemade cream of mushroom soup will just make this a lot nicer. Let me grab my butter over here, because we're going to be using this to kind of make the base, like a roux base almost, for our cream of mushroom soup. We're going to be using 4 cans of tuna. So these are 5-ounce cans, and when you drain them, they'll be 4 ounces. So let me grab a bowl here for this, and we're going to have to drain them. Now, I like to use mine in water instead of oil, because I think it makes it less heavy of a casserole versus if you do the tuna in oil, it's a bit more greasy. So I do packed in water. And you don't need to, for a tuna casserole, you don't need to go fancy with your tuna. You can just kind of keep it, oh, we're losing part of ours, there we go. You can just keep it your, chunk light or whatever. Only for like salads would you're gonna really use a fancy like canned tuna for it. Let's get these drained, but make sure you drain them, because if you add too much liquid, again, you'll get to a more mushy casserole versus a delicious casserole. They always make these in such little cans. I know, just the other day, it was so funny, I bought actually tuna, because I was like, gosh, I haven't made a tuna melt in forever, and I've been kind of craving one. That might be on my next line. I was like waiting till my kids go off, back to school, because they do not like tuna or the smell of tuna, and I think it's so delicious. My husband does not. There we go. We'll get our last one kind of strained here. And so we just kind of have our juices out of here so that we're not going to make it too mushy. Let's get these mushrooms kind of stirred. We should be starting to get this nice. Yeah, good. We're all getting these lovely kind of brown edges on them. So again, perfect. You want to make sure you get enough kind of cook time on the mushrooms. So you want them to be tender before you start making kind of your roux base and changing them up a little bit. So I'm going to add in about, I want to say, 2.5 tablespoons of butter here. And butter is what's going to really thicken this up nicely versus using oil. Now you can just use oil to do it, but the butter, I think, gives you just that nicer flavor and texture. Okay, we're gonna let this melt, and then we're gonna sprinkle some flour over this to thicken it up, and then we'll be adding in, I'm gonna do vegetable broth and cream for this. So I'll use some vegetable bouillon, but you can use chicken bouillon for it as well. And I like to use the bouillon over the like a chicken broth or a vegetable broth because I feel like it doesn't have quite as much flavor than if you use the bouillon. You can use a little bit more to bring out a lot more flavor. So a big heaping spoonful, I'm just using up the rest of this. This is probably about a tablespoon or so, maybe a smidge more, but it just packs a better punch of flavor. And I'm gonna be using this in replace of adding kind of salt into my casserole. We might use a little bit of salt towards the end, just for taste, but with using the bouillon over a broth, you don't need to add that much salt, if any. Go. So now that my butter is nice and melted, let's get our flour, and we're going to sprinkle our flour over the top. I'm going to use probably about 2 tablespoons in here, maybe a little bit more. I'm going to look at it first to see as we mix it up. But again, we're making kind of the roux base for our cream of mushroom soup part of our tuna casserole. So we're gonna mix this up. Again, I'm going for about 2 to 3 tablespoons, which I'm just visually measuring here. But I wanna kind of coat them until we have just this nice kind of little powdery, thick little broth over it. There we go. And this is gonna add in a lot of flavor. And what we're gonna do is I'm gonna slowly add in my broth for this until it's thickened up. I'm gonna add just a smidge more flour. I've got about a teaspoon left in here, so we'll just use the rest of that. I will say, I always have a little container of flour out on my counters for when I'm cooking, so I don't always have to get my big tub out. And I will say, I love it. It makes it a little bit easier when you're like, oh, I just need a pinch of that flour. I have one for sugar and salt and pepper. Okay, perfect. So now you see we've got them, they're kind of thick, kind of a thick coating on them. We're gonna add in our vegetable broth, then we're gonna add in our cream. We're gonna add in a little bit at a time, because again, we don't want it to, get completely drenched up yet. There we go. And I have mine cooking over, I'm got it on a 2, but I'm gonna turn it up to about a 4.5 right now. But you see how we're adding this in here and it's already just starting to thicken up nicely. We'll add a little bit more, little by little. And I'm gonna again bring my, maybe a little higher because I want it to come to a low boil right now. There we go. And I'm making sure I'm kind of glazing the bottom of my pan where we have those vegetables sauteing in there so that they kind of bring up some just nice flavors, that anything that got stuck on there while cooking.
Oh, you have a question? What size pan is that?
This is a 6-quart saute pan by All Clad. So it's nice, it's big. I love it because I'll be able to throw my noodles and everything and toss it in here. And then I'm gonna put it in just a little aluminum foil casserole dish to kind of bake up because this will be going to my friend's house. Add a little bit more. So I had about 3 cups of broth in there. Before I add that last bit, I'm gonna add in a bit of my cream, and we're gonna bring this kind of temperature of the boil. So we'll use anywhere between 1.5 to 2 cups of cream. You can also go more or less decadent and use half and half or even whole milk and in there, but I figured if we're gonna make it rich and delicious, we're gonna go all out with the good stuff. I will say, I was like, so right now I've got about 1.5 cups of cream in here. We're gonna start and then I'm gonna look at it and see how, it's thickening up. Because I don't want it to be too runny for our tuna casserole.
You have a question? Do any of your children show an interest in cooking?
Yeah, actually 2 of mine, my My youngest, they can't really, you know, they're 2 and well, almost 2 and 4. Although Teddy loves to help me in the kitchen all the time. But my 10-year-old and my 13-year-old, they both are interested in it. I will say my 13-year-old son has a really lovely palate. He's really good at like finding like the obscure flavors and things. Delicious. I don't think I'll need to add in any more salt, which is perfect. That's what I said. The nice thing about using the bouillon instead of salt, or instead of broth, is it gives you that saltiness, but it's not a direct salt. It's more of that savory, brothy salt flavor. So again, we're slowly mixing this in, and then we're gonna add in our peas, and then our tuna, and then our noodles, and we'll get this to start kind of baking in the oven. This is a dish that doesn't take long to bake in the oven, so that's also kind of a plus. Here we go. And again, I'm just moving it. I'm gonna put that last little bit in. So you don't scorch anything on the bottom because we are using that kind of cream base. I will add some pepper in here because that will bring those flavors together. But you don't need to add a lot of different spices. This is one of those dishes where, you know, simple. We're gonna add, so that's about a half a teaspoon of ground black pepper.
You have a question? How long do you know to stir it for?
I kind of look for the consistency of it and that it's thickening up. The longer you cook it, the thicker it will get because it will reduce more. So we're at a pretty good one. Do you see? It's like a really thick kind of cream. It's got, you know, a nice rolling bubble on it because remember, we didn't cook all of our noodles all the way through. So this is gonna soak up, the noodles will soak up some of it, but you don't want it, oops, look at me. I lost my spatula in there. Good thing this is a thermocoil or therma spatula. Let me pop this out. I'll wash my hands. Okay, let me turn this guy down since we're nice and low now. We'll get a different spoon. Hopefully I don't lose it. That's the one thing about having a really big pot is they can just slide that way if you, here. Let's add our peas in. So this is a little over a cup of peas, and they were just frozen peas that I thawed and brought down, you know, so they're like room temperature here. You could always add in a bit more if you want, but I think a little, like it was like a cup and a half, a little bit more for it. Green beans are also excellent in this, so there's a lot of different things that you can do. Now we're gonna add in our tuna. Let me grab. Make sure again you have it drained so that you're not adding a bunch of liquid that will then thin out the sauce that we've made. And I'm adding in, so this is 4 5-ounce containers, but when it's all said and done, it's about a pound of tuna. And again, these are packed in water, not oil. I find the oil ones just make the tuna casserole a bit more greasy. So it's, you know, I prefer the water packed. But if you like it with the oil, you can definitely do it that way. There we go. And this is not one where you can really sub out fresh tuna for this. It just doesn't quite have that right consistency unless you were to cook your fresh tuna all the way through. Maybe if you had the leftover tuna steaks, you might be able to repurpose that into a casserole. Here we go. So I've got all of our tuna in here.
No question. What brand tuna are you using?
This is just the good old Star-Kissed tuna. I feel like that's the brand I grew up with. That and was it like Chicken of the Sea? That brand, and that could be Star-Kissed as well. I just remember those 2 brands. So we're just gonna give it a good mix up in there, and those flavors, that tuna flavor, that's where it's gonna kind of pop in here. I'm gonna take a little taste here, make sure I don't need to add any more spices. Perfect, delicious. Now here is my pound of egg noodles. I did the wide egg noodles, not the super thin ones. And we cooked them for just about 5 minutes. So remember, they're not completely cooked all the way through. We're gonna just pop them in here. Once I start stirring them, they're gonna break apart. So don't worry about that. You don't need to mix in any butter or oil with them when you do it. They'll pop apart when you, as soon as they get covered in this sauce. Here we go. But again, do not cook them all the way until, you know, cooked all the way through, because that will then give you they'll get overdone as you bake this in the oven. And a lot of people will be like, sometimes their tuna casseroles turn out too dry, or, you know, they're too wet. You've got to be really careful on building your sauce and making sure that it's either not too runny or not enough of it. Because if it's not enough, as these noodles bake, they suck up the liquid. So you want it enough in there to give it a really creamy base.
You have a question? What type of noodles, and can you go over everything that's in the pan?
Yes. So the noodles are just, see, I have a bag right here. It's just a bag of extra wide egg noodles, typically on the bottom shelf in the pasta aisle. And I used the whole pound in there. And what we have in here is mushrooms, peas, sweet peppers, and 4 cans of tuna. And then we made our own homemade cream of mushroom soup. After we sauteed up those mushrooms, we added in vegetable broth and cream for this. So those are kind of that, and a little bit of flour, of course, and butter to thicken it up. So here is our base for our tuna casserole. If I was keeping this here, I would put my breadcrumbs over this and pop it in the oven, but since I am going to be sending this off to friends, we are going to load it up in our little baked dish. And this is one of those things that you can make this dish ahead of time, and then just before, you can make it up to like 3 days ahead of time if you wanted to. And then you just wouldn't put the breadcrumbs on until right before you bake it. And this only needs to bake for about 15 to 20 minutes because everything is in here cooked. You're really just marrying those flavors together, allowing the noodles to soak up a little bit of that extra juice, that sauce in here, and letting those breadcrumbs kind of crisp up. You could also eat it just like this as well, and not even bake it if you don't want to. Here we go. We'll just scoop all of this in here. This is why I love this big pan here, because making that homemade cream of mushroom soup, it just is going to elevate the flavor of the tuna casserole. It's just going to make it a lot more lovely. And this whole thing fits in there, and it's being able to do it in a pan like this, it's so nice, I will say, especially if you do lots of like pasta dishes. I love my big 6-quart saute pan. I have one in a 3-quart, which I find is really great for doing rice dishes. There. So let's make sure we get all of this delicious sauce in here, because again, the sauce is going to be crucial for making sure it's not too dry or too wet. There we go. So I've got all of it here. I'm just going to give it a little kind of pat down everywhere. And now we're going to take our breadcrumbs over here. So remember, this was our panko breadcrumbs mixed with a little bit of olive oil and Parmesan cheese. And we're just going to sprinkle this as evenly as we can over the top of this.
You have a question? Is this an easy dish to freeze, and can you freeze leftovers?
Yes, you could definitely freeze this up. You just wouldn't want to add the breadcrumbs on. You'd always just save that till later, so that if you wanted to reheat it, you'd pop it, you'd de-thaw it, and then once it was unthawed, you cover it with these breadcrumbs and pop it in the oven. Because if you put the breadcrumbs on, they'll get soggy and they won't be crunchy. You can also use crushed potato chips or crispy fried onions on the top of this dish. So, a lot of different crunch flavors that are available. I feel like the crushed potato chips is very 1950s-esque to me. I feel like that would be a bag of Utz potato chips crushed on there. Okay, we're gonna pop this in the oven. This is gonna bake at about 425 for, again, 15 or so minutes, 15, 20 minutes. It doesn't take long. And remember, we have our blueberry crisp. Well, actually, perfect timing. The crisp is about to come out, so I can actually just bring that up. Look at our beautiful blueberry crisp here. So we'll grab that out. It is nice and bubbly and perfect. Okay, I'm gonna transfer it on here. We're gonna bring this blueberry crisp for them as well to have a nice little dessert. And then we're gonna pop our tuna casserole in. I'm just gonna slide it right here. And then let's get our tuna casserole in the oven. So we're gonna bake this at 425. So I'm gonna bring my thing up. And again, this doesn't need very long to bake. So let me turn my oven, bake 425. And I'm gonna set my timer for about 15 minutes. And it will, we'll have it cook up. We just really want those breadcrumbs to get kind of golden and crunchy and crispy and good. Now, while we're waiting for that, I said we've got a lot of sourdough breads we need to pop up. But let me move my blueberry crisp over here. But you can see we've just got that golden brown crumb on the top of there. That blueberry gel is kind of oozing up through. But it just creates this really delicious, like fruity, and that crumb flavor. I think the crumb is just so delicious. Okay, let me move over here.
Are you asking for clarification? Was it breadcrumbs or panko that you put on top?
So panko breadcrumbs, which is the Japanese style breadcrumb. And there was Parmesan cheese mixed into that, about 2 tablespoons of Parmesan cheese, and about a tablespoon to 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And you gotta mix those together. You can always omit the cheese if you want to, but it adds just a little extra flavor there. Okay, let's get our kind of meal prep. Tonight we're gonna have a focaccia with dinner. So let's prep up our focaccia real quick. And then I've got my sourdough loaf. So we're gonna do a sourdough focaccia for this, which is, it's a really flat kind of bread that is crispy, that has a lot of flavoring and seasoning on it. Let me grab my starter.
You have a question? Do you know what's for dinner yet?
The question of the day. I think I might actually be making some pork chops tonight for dinner. So I actually have a little bit of an idea. My friend, they were deciding what meal they wanted us to bring, and they were deciding, first it was pork chops, and then I'm like, oh, that sounds good, I want pork chops. And then they're like, oh, could it be tuna casserole? And I was like, definitely, whatever you want. I fed my starter this morning, bright and early at like 6 a.m. I was up, back to school, so it is nice and bubbly and active. Let me grab this. For this recipe, we are going to start out with, let me pop it down, and we love this. If you look at it, it's my favorite part of it. But we're gonna start with about 175 grams of active starter. So this is a pretty heavy starter recipe in here, but we wanted to have a kind of a quicker rise because we're going to be baking it up in a couple of hours, and so we want it to kind of puff up in enough time. So 175 grams. There we go. Don't need any more from that one. And then we're going to add in 400 grams of water. So let me bring this back to 0. And I'm using warm water. It just mixes into the flour a little bit nicer when we do it. There we go. And just making, it's always like a, there we go. Ooh, all right on that. So we're gonna dilute this in here. So I'm just gonna use my dough whisk, which is this kind of cool little whisk here. It allows this dough to pass through it versus like with a spoon, it all clumps in the basin of it, which is kind of a great tool for making sourdough. Okay, we've got that here. Now we're gonna add in about 1.5 teaspoons of salt, which is roughly like 8 to 9 grams if you wanted to do it that way. I just kind of do two little handfuls in there. We are going to be seasoning it up a lot more because the focaccia, we'll cover it with some oil. We'll stretch it out on the length of a baking sheet, and then we'll kind of cover it up and season it with some fresh herbs and whatnot. And then it's really simple. The rest we're going to use is just 400 grams of flour on here. There we go. They're not gonna. I'm gonna have to get a little bowl. Mine's nice and heavy here. Let's get this one. So for this, you don't have to use bread flour. You can use all-purpose. And since whenever I don't have to use bread flour, I use all-purpose in place because it's a little bit cheaper. But we need about 400 grams for this. And this is going to be the focaccia for the dough for tonight's dinner. And it's a high hydration dough, so it will be a little bit sticky, but it's gonna add, it will be like, we're gonna season it up with, I'm gonna go out into my garden and I'll pick some basil, rosemary, fresh herbs. It really makes it shine, but it's a nice thin loaf of bread, and it is so delicious, because it's not, I always say it's not even a loaf, it's like a pizza crust if you think about it. But this is gonna be a high hydration, so it's gonna get less wet the longer it does its rises and stuff like that, and it'll be more malleable, but it is a high hydration dough. A little bit more than even my sourdough is. Okay, that is literally all you need for the focaccia until we're ready to bake it. The focaccia. I always mess up saying it, guys. I know. It's one of those things, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Okay, for our next base, we're gonna prep up. We're gonna do, we'll make our dough for it, but we're gonna do an apple cinnamon one. And it's gonna start out, I actually start out using my traditional base. So it's pretty simple. It's 150 grams of active starter. And don't worry, I have a second jar of starter. I always have lots and lots of starters going here. So we'll use a little bit of this one and a little bit of that one.
You have a question? Where did you get your scale?
This scale I actually had since I was in college. I've had it forever, and they don't make it anymore. But I have one that I love even more than this that I use at my parents' house, and I have it in my Amazon storefront. But the problem with this scale is it doesn't allow you to do large amounts. But I'm like one of those people, I'm like, oh, I already have a scale. I don't need to buy another one. And I keep saying, I'm like, I do, but I'm not going to, because this one works until it doesn't. So we need 150 grams, but I do have a KitchenAid one that I love that's in my storefront that works even better than this one. So that's not quite 100, but we're gonna use a little bit of this as well. There we go. So 150 grams of our starter here. And then we're gonna add in 565 grams of water. This makes a pretty good sized loaf. So I'm gonna need a little bit more than this. So that brought me up to 450. So we need a smidge more. There we go.
You have a question? Do you name your sourdough?
I don't necessarily name it. I call it he. I call everything I make he.
Gus.
My husband says we should name it Gustus. He really wants to get another dog so that we can name it Augustus Gustavus, so it could be Gus. He really wanted to name our 5th kid that, and I was like, I'm sorry, as much as I love Gus, I cannot name my kid that.
Hey, Gus plays.
Okay, we're just gonna dilute this guy up until you've got a nice kind of milky batter there. That's kind of like the really key in part is doing this stage. You can't just like throw all of your ingredients together. You do really have to like mix it up separately. And kind of allow it's like the autolyse stage here. And then we're gonna add in about a tablespoon of salt here. because this is a big loaf. This isn't a small loaf. So it's about a tablespoon here. And we're gonna do, this is my cinnamon loaf. We're gonna add cinnamon in 2 parts. I add it in the loaf, and then I add it also when we are going to do our stretch and folds and laminate it. I also add it in there as well after we laminate it out to add just an extra pop. But I do cinnamon sugar then. So we're gonna add in about a teaspoon or so of cinnamon. Now cinnamon, I will say, do a smidge more, likes to sit on top of your water or your milk. It doesn't mix in as well. So it will sit on top until we add that flour in there. There we go. But I always like to get it because I like that flavor to kind of soak in. And then we're gonna do 750 grams of flour here. And this one I actually want to use bread flour for. So let me grab my bread flour. Bread flour for the actual loaves turns out a little bit better because this is going to sit a lot longer. It's going to have a chance to kind of build the gluten thing on here. And you want to use unbleached. I will say with the sourdough journey, always used unbleached. Because that bleaching process kills the natural yeast that occurs on flour. So we need 750 grams. That got me about 450, so 300 more. I will say, Amazon, they sell their own flour and they make it unbleached, and it is a lot cheaper than what you can get at the store, which is, I always think, is a win. You know, we're always cooking for a large amount of people here, so anything to cut back on those groceries, because today's groceries cost a lot more than they used to. I always love seeing those like throwback and like, this is what it cost back then, and I was like, oh, if only. I almost at it. Look at this nice mountain. So that is 750 grams on the nose, exactly 750 grams. Now this, oh, when in doubt, almost. There we go. Add it in. I will say this already smells like a nice cinnamon roll. That's just so delicious. Okay, we're gonna mix this guy in here. Now this is not going to be quite as sticky as our focaccia. I'm gonna make sure, I'm eventually gonna learn how to say it right. Because it's got a little bit less, it's not quite as high of a hydration on there, which means that it's a little bit easier to work with. It's not quite as sticky, but with all sourdough, you don't do the traditional kneading that you would with a yeast-based bread. You do what they call a stretch and a pull. And you do that for the first 2 hours, about every 20 to 30 minutes. And the way that you get the dough to not stick to you is you just wet your hands, and that kind of creates a non-stick on it. Here we go. So we've got our beautiful cinnamon-based dough for it, and then we're gonna cut up some apples, and we'll toss those with a little bit of cinnamon sugar, and they're gonna go into this loaf as well. It's gonna just make it all the better. We only need 1 apple for this because we're gonna cut them up into pretty small chunks here. So let me I'll grab my knife over here, we'll give it a quick rinse. And grab my cutting board that we never used. I have these like ridiculous fruit cutting boards. They're so kind of cute. So I'm gonna cut these in 4th, and then I'm gonna get my paring knife to peel it, and then we'll chop it up. But think small. When you don't want it to be too thick or too big, these apple slices, and you want the skin off because the skin never gets tender. So I always peel it, and you want to use a tart apple for this, so Granny Smith works great. Because you want that tart flavor to kind of come through in here. We're gonna be sprinkling some cinnamon sugar on it, but it's just works out a little bit better. Peel the skin. I know a lot of times whenever you make apple dishes, you're like, do I really have to peel off the skin? Yes. The apple skin does not get tender. So what will happen is you'll have it in your bread and you'll just have like a chewy bit. So this is gonna end up much nicer if you trim it off. And then we'll add this in here, mince it up. Really small, because I find if you make your apple chunks too big, then it kind of messes with the texture of the bread a little bit. You'll have just these hard pieces. We have our tuna casserole is almost ready. I peeked over there. There's about a minute or so left on it. So we're gonna kind of chop this up nice and small because I want these nice little apple bits all throughout. So you see, so you're not gonna use a whole lot. I find if you overload your sourdough, then it won't get as much of a pop, especially during the lamination stage. We'll mince these up and then we'll go grab that tuna casserole out because it's one of those nice things. It can sit for a minute or two on there. So let's get these minced up. And there we go. So again, really little teeny tiny bits. And you can see when you cut them up a lot smaller, you actually get a lot more on there than you think. It's always like potatoes. When you cut them up, they're always a lot bigger than you think. So we'll just go over here. Okay, let's go grab our tuna casserole out. I'm gonna move this over here so I have a place to put it. And then we can season those up and put it in here. Okay, beautiful. Look how those crisped up so nicely. We've got that golden kind of color on there. What really helps that is the oil and the Parmesan cheese in there. Gives you this kind of perfect little crunch on there, which will be delicious. And it's one of those things where like, wow, we did a lot of prep, but you could always, if you love this, you could make a bunch of them, you know, freeze down some of them, have them prepped, and then when it's time, you just make your crumb topping to kind of bake on there for your just kind of classic tuna casserole over it. You know, we used, there was 4 cans of tuna in it. We made our own cream of mushroom soup. We used, 8 ounces of fresh mushrooms, sauteed them up, made a delicious kind of butter roux, and then added in vegetable broth and cream for that just rich flavor. We also added in some sweet peppers that we sauteed up. We have about 1.5 cups of peas, and we use extra wide noodles for just delicious. And this, we're gonna serve this up for my friends. They're gonna have it with the blueberry crisp that we made, where we took about almost a pound of fresh blueberries. We made this lovely kind of little slurry base with them using sugar, lemon juice, vanilla, and cornstarch, kind of that base, and then we made that crumb topping with oats and brown sugar. And now we're gonna finish up our cinnamon apple sourdough loaf. And these will all be pulling thing. We'll shape them tonight in our dinner stream, and then they'll go in the fridge to proof, except our focaccia, we'll let that sit and we're gonna bake that up tonight. So I'm gonna sprinkle my apples right here with a little bit of cinnamon, kind of coat them, and then that's probably like 1/2 teaspoon. Got a little bit of this lemon left. This is just gonna prevent them from going brown. So just squeezing a little bit of that lemon juice over there also keeps them nice and tart. And then let me grab a little bit of our sugar. We don't need much. I'm gonna kind of coat this up. So I'm gonna use, this is like 1/8 cup, so about 2 to 3 tablespoons. Not even gonna use all of it. We're just gonna mix it here. But I like them to get a little bit of sweetness because they're gonna have these like kind of pops of flavor in there. There we go. And so you can always add your apples in on some different parts. You could add them during the lamination stage. I like to add them in now so that I will have those apple flavors will actually kind of go into the loaf. So We're gonna put them in here and then we'll do our stretch and pulls around it to kind of incorporate. And I do it at the first stretch and pulls because then they get thoroughly mixed through by the time we are ready for them. Okay. So wet fingers, always use wet fingers. And we're just gonna pull up from the sides and kind of fold it over. Because remember, it's a high hydration dough, so you can't really work with it the way you would typical dough. And I'm just gonna keep pulling it around and kind of mix it. And now by the time we've done our 4 rounds of stretch and pulls, this is the first one, this will be completely incorporated. Well guys, thank you so much for joining us here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I try to do live cooking shows every single day, kind of show you what we're making and hopefully teach you guys something along the way. Again, we do upload all of our videos to the link on our page, so if you ever want to recreate any of these recipes at home, all you have to do is go to that link, search for what we made today. So we made our tuna casserole and our blueberry crisp, so you can always learn to make those at home again. And we also have a link to our Amazon storefront that has all of our different cooking gadgets and gear in there. I've got my HexClad, my All-Clad pans, my knives, everything I use in this kitchen. I've got my sourdough kits and stuff like in there, everything for you guys to check out if you're interested. But again, guys, thank you so much for joining us here today.